At this point, I'd like to introduce Scott Friedman, our Dean for Therapeutic Discovery, and I'd like to thank Scott and his team and Rama Iyengar and her team for developing this conference, which we hope will become a very important annual event. Scott?
If I can ask June and John. Is Jeff Smith here? So good morning, everybody. For those of you in the back, there's lots of seats up front. While everybody's getting seated, I'll introduce myself. I'm Scott Friedman. I'm the Dean of Therapeutic Discovery, and I'm delighted to introduce my co-chairs in this session entitled Blueprints for Innovation in Academia. It's Nadim Choudhury and Anthony Melendez, who are Mount Sinai Medical students. The purpose of this week's conference is to capture and explore all elements that drive innovation in academic health centers, from the educational ingredients to who pays for it to the people and the partnership. We want to learn what works and what doesn't, and how we can effectively execute the vision that you heard from Dean Charney. We're very grateful to our speakers, our sponsors, and the support of the entire Mount Sinai community, especially the Dean's Office, in creating this historic program. In this first panel, we're fortunate to have exceptional leaders from two of the iconic institutions who have really redefined innovation in healthcare and science, MIT and UCSF, John Collins and June Lee. Unfortunately, Daria Moakley-Rosen from Stanford has the flu, and she had to cancel at the last minute. But in her place, in the spirit of innovation, I'm delighted to include our own Geoffrey Smith, who's the director of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship, and hope that all three of our speakers or panelists will reflect on the many principles established by their institutions and their life and career experience. I'll also remind you that we're not only taking questions during the course of this panel from the microphones, but also using Twitter. You see the hashtag up behind me. And so perhaps I'll ask my panelists if they could spend a little more time introducing themselves and spend a few minutes telling us about your program, what you've learned, the history of it, and then we can take more questions. June, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Hi, I'm June Lee. I'm the Director of Early Translational Research at UCSF. I've been in that position now for about 1.5 years. I'm a pulmonary critical care physician by training. I trained at UCSF and was on faculty there for a number of years, and then left and did drug development at Genentech and worked in a variety of capacities. With my last position at Genentech being that of a therapeutic area head in early clinical development, overseeing metabolism and cardiovascular diseases, infectious diseases, as well as respiratory diseases. And I came back to UCSF to take on this new, very interesting role, overseeing early translational research, and that was really that the charge was just to figure out how to make early translational research work better. I belong in the CTSI, or Clinical Translational Science Institute within UCSF. And the program to which Scott is referring to is a program called T1 Catalyst Program. It's a program that predated my arrival at UCSF, but in the last year, last year to 1.5 years has gone through a substantial evolution. And it's a program that is directed, that's focused on really identifying the technologies with the greatest product potential, and doing, leveraging all of the resources that we have at UCSF and all the resources we have around us in the Bay Area to actually enable and then support that program. And I can talk a little bit more. Do you want to hear a little more about that program?
Please do, yeah.
So how we identify the most promising technologies is by leveraging a review panel that's largely made up of external experts. We now have about 90+ experts who have a variety of expertise in drug development, diagnostics development, device development, as well as digital health development, who are signed on to help our faculty. These are folks who, like John Snitsky, who you'll hear from in a couple of days, who's at Quest Diagnostics, but we have lots of folks from places like Genentech and Pfizer and others as well, VCs and IP attorneys who are all signed on, to really not just provide review, but in the enabling and supporting process, when we decide that a program has enough potential to then receive consultation help, they roll their sleeves up and really get involved to help them address the issues that have been identified to be the biggest hurdles going forward, the biggest challenges that the technology has to address. If it's IP, then we set them up with an IP attorney who then helps that investigator work through the IP challenges. If it's a conversation around target product profile for a particular technology, that needs to happen. Even though it may be very early in the stage, we set them up with a number of people who might be able to provide them what the competitive landscape looks like, what the standard of care looks like in that space, and what the therapeutic expectations in that disease looks like in 5-10 years time frame. So it's really it's really put together with the notion that translating innovation into useful product is a team science, and that it really is a multidisciplinary effort. And that team, while some of the expertise that comprises members of that team resides in the university, some do not. And we're okay with that. We import team members from outside of the university as needed. And we really try to create sort of a virtual incubator setting for technologies that are most promising. And we really help to shepherd through the critical aspects of technology to a place where decisions can be made. We also believe that in terms of what the right timing is for that intervention to happen, we believe that there is a very finite window of time very early in the process when small pivot shifts can be made where an innovation can optimize its potential to be a product or not. And so we choose to get involved as early as allowed, as early as we are called on to be involved. So I'll share more about the program later. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, June. If I can, I'll jump over Jeff for a second and introduce other outside guest panelist, John Collins from the CIMIT program in Boston. Dr. Collins, do you want to tell us a little bit about your program and how it fits in the innovation world?
Sure. First, a little bit of a personal background. I'm a mechanical engineer from way back when. I spent most of my career doing product development and commercialization, working for Booz Allen and a lot of other companies, both helping figure out how companies innovate and, more importantly, helping them innovate. And if you had told me 5 years ago I'd be sitting in an academic setting, I would tell you you're absolutely crazy. But I think this is the sort of collaborations that really make things work. And I have seen that really the academic world and the industry world are so different in so many ways. And the opportunities for collaboration are huge. And that's why I think I've enjoyed CIMIT so much. Now, CIMIT as an organization has been around for about 14 years. Started by a collaboration between Mass General Hospital, Brigham and Women's Hospital, MIT, and Draper Labs. And this started before kind of collaboration was in vogue and translational research was in vogue. So you can well imagine the reception that our founder, Dr. Parrish, had when he went to the president, say, of MIT and said, "You guys don't have all the resources that you need." What, are you kidding me? And certainly over probably 4 or 5 years, as CIMIT got traction, the other institutions across Boston started to take notice that there really was something pretty unique here. So at CIMIT, really, we're focused on accelerating the healthcare innovation cycle. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit later, but really that's a very important concept. When you think about innovation in healthcare, it's not about the idea, it is not about the technology. Our belief is unless and until a patient benefits from an idea, it is not an innovation innovation. And innovation is not a science. It is not an idea. It is something that impacts patients. And our particular angle is doing that through multidisciplinary, multi-institutional collaborations, in particular bringing together the clinical, engineering, and entrepreneurial experiences that you need in order to get innovations into the marketplace. So CIMIT's model, generally we refer to it as finding, funding, and facilitating. So we have a number of vehicles to find great problems, sometimes great ideas, but more often great problems. We have content experts we call program leaders that are focused on thematic areas, and their mission really is to gel the entire consortium. We also have individuals we call site miners. Those are senior people at each one of our member institutions who report to the president or CEO. And his job, his or her mission in life, and they spend about 20 to 30% of their time in this particular role, is making CIMIT work for the organization. So they help find rising stars. They help break down internal administrative issues, finding lab space, providing counseling for animal use requirements, whatever it might be. We also have people like myself, we refer to as internal facilitators, who will be able to provide kind of an integrated perspective on intellectual property, on dealing with regulatory issues, on commercialization issues. Now, CIMIT, what we do is the funding side, we've got two different funding vehicles. One we refer to as innovation awards. These are small $100,000 awards that go to collaborative teams. I think most people recognize you don't get a lot of science done for $100,000. So generally speaking, what these awards really go towards kind of problem-driven opportunities where you customize, adapt a technology that might have been developed for the aerospace industry, as opposed to only trying to develop new science and technology. The other thing that we formalized a couple of years ago is something we refer to as our Accelerator Awards. And these are for projects that we see have the potential of reaching a commercial exit in 12 to 18 months. So for us, a commercial exit means someone else is going to make an investment in this technology, motivated by a commercial reward. And our mission oftentimes is we see there's so many great technologies that are sitting in academia, but the people who are driving it are academics. And the last thing we want to do is take a great clinical researcher and require that he or she do something, frankly, that they're not trained to do and not necessarily interested in doing. So we provide an interim team, if you will, that provides synthesized feedback to basically drive that to commercialization. So again, what CIMIT sees as innovation is a process. It's a process like anything else. For us, we believe it starts and stops with clinical practice. We measured this process a couple of years ago, something we refer to as our clinical impact study, to kind of do a look back on, well, CIMIT's been doing this for a while, does it really work? And the results of that are on our website, and happy to talk about it more. The other thing that we have been doing is really leveraging that, as a process, there are all sorts of new tools that are available, not only tools to help clinical practice, but tools to help collaboration. Cloud-based resources are absolutely tremendous resources when you think that you need to have people that operate behind different firewalls to be able to talk to each other in an open, collaborative way. For all of you that have struggled with sending emails back and forth and worrying about rev control, versus you think about a company, in Verizon's case, for an example, you can well imagine that there is a process that an organization will go through to innovate. And what we're trying to do as CIMIT is to create a similar open structure that allows different groups to collaborate in a process. We call that CoLab. CIMIT is a Boston-based organization. We believe a lot of what we do is a contact sport, but we have been approached by a number of different groups across the globe. And for the last 4 years, there's been a group in Manchester, UK, that we've been working with that have replicated the CIMIT model there, and in Singapore. And both have worked very, very well. And we're in discussions now with a handful of others. So just to kind of summarize some of the key lessons that we've learned, first and foremost in our world, and again, we tend to focus more on devices, procedures, clinical systems, more and more into drug delivery, biologic delivery, and starting to get our toe more into therapeutics. But for our experience, first and foremost, clinical pull. The insight that you have around problems and really delivering care are gold, absolute gold. So focus on those. The other issue that we struggled with for years and years is, do you plant 1,000 seeds and see what grows, or do you focus on one or two areas like a company would? And we found kind of neither and both work. So what we've found is clusters of activity work really well, where you focus on thematic areas and you don't manage them in a command and control mode, but basically you create nodes and opportunities for those people to work together. And what you'll find is that the sum is much greater than the parts. And for us, facilitation is absolutely, I think, what's probably most unique about the CIMIT model and most important in providing those experts that really understand how to move an idea along. And again, they come from both the content side, from our program leaders and site miners, as well as more from the process side, from our own staff. And as a result, what we found in our world is that our junior faculty is every bit as successful as our senior faculty members in innovating. Of course, every senior faculty member says, well, of course, I mentor my junior faculty members. But also, you can get an awful lot done with a little bit of money. So these $100,000 grants certainly don't get a product to a marketplace, but what we find is they provide enough money where others will put money in. And our experience has been so far, there's about a 12x return. For every dollar that CIMIT puts into a portfolio of projects, about 12 more dollars go into that, either from the NIH to the investigators, or the larger part of it is frankly from commercial partners that will take those technologies over and invest in them themselves.
That was a terrific overview. Thank you. And Jeff, if you could introduce yourself and your background and maybe reflect on the programs these programs and others in the context of innovation in academia.
Great. So my name's Jeff Smith. I joined the faculty here at Mount Sinai this summer. For the better part of the last 20 years, I have been a serial entrepreneur and venture capitalist in sort of the gamut of healthcare. Started out on the data management side of the world, moved into running clinical trials, and then moved into developing technologies directly. Our venture fund invests at the very earliest stage of technology development. So a third of the companies in our portfolio we've co-founded. Most of those we've co-founded with an academic collaborator. We have, I think, except in 2 instances, always gotten involved with projects at a preclinical stage. So I come from the earliest part of when technology begins to move from the academic setting into the commercial setting. And since 2008, it's been a pretty different world. The money is less, the risk tolerance is less, the number of venture capital funds has fallen by about 50%, the amount of venture capital dollars available has fallen dramatically. And that's part of what drove my interest in thinking about academic medical centers as a platform that we could potentially do more with as we think about technology development. So, one of the challenges for VCs is historically we made a lot of money when our companies went public. We had an initial public offering. It was a big deal. Hasn't happened for us in some time because the public markets have gotten less interested in promises and hype and have been more interested in results, and that means that we have to carry our companies further. But it also means that we primarily rely at this point on mergers or acquisitions to realize our return on investment. And as a result, our agenda, the venture capital agenda, has really begun to be driven by the agenda of the large acquiring companies. So I may think that Alzheimer's is a critical problem for society, and I may want to invest in a company developing a technology to treat Alzheimer's. But when a large portion of the potential buyers announce that they're getting out of the CNS area because development is too difficult, my ability to invest at the early stage to develop Alzheimer's therapies becomes highly restricted. So the buyer community drives our agenda to a large extent. And I think that's where universities need to step into the gap. And I think programs like CIMIT and what June described at UCSF, and I can talk a little bit about what Daria would have talked about as far as Stanford, it's an opportunity. And why should universities step into this gap? Well, obviously, if we can develop technologies and license them out or sell them, we generate revenue for our institutions, which is a good thing. But importantly, the mission of our institutions are to push discoveries into the public domain, to better human health by getting technology to patients. And to do that, we have to interact quite closely with commercial enterprise, because that's how the system works in this country to get products to patients. And so by becoming more involved in the development, we further that mission. I think it helps recruiting and retaining faculty. And you read about the unemployment rate in this country, and clearly jobs are a real issue. But for talented people, there's always demand. And it's very important for these academic institutions to be able to capture talent. And so I think by stepping into this gap and finding a way to encourage faculty, to encourage students, to drive the institution to be more involved with technology development, we can bring an interesting and diverse set of faculty into the school. And finally, I think that the opportunity to stimulate knowledge sharing, to push expertise out, to be more interdisciplinary is really important in stepping into this gap. When you talk to people who may be thinking about a problem from an industrial perspective as opposed to an academic perspective, you learn new things. And it may cycle back into your basic research and impact it in ways you can't predict. And so it's another reason why it's very important to engage in this dialogue or this interchange with the commercial technology development world. So I read a piece by a Harvard Medical School researcher named John Frangione in a recent issue of Nature Biotech. And he gave this great description. He said, "New biomedical technology starts life as an endangered species." And I think that's a great metaphor. When you have that little fledgling idea, the likelihood that you will ever get anywhere near the market is low. It's actually kind of depressingly low. And one of the things we need to do about that, or think about why, and we need to think about from a process perspective what we can do to improve that. And so CIMIT is a good example of a series of very process-oriented steps to improve the likelihood that that little fledgling idea that you've come up with in your lab may get out to the market someday. And if you think of the number of handoffs that typically occur in the commercialization process, so you start in your lab and you have this great idea, and then you go to your institutional technology transfer office and they go out and they try to license it, and then it gets licensed to some little startup. And maybe the startup struggles and fails, and so it comes back to the technology transfer office, and then they license it out again, and maybe that company does a little bit better, and then it gets acquired by a bigger company. It's a lot of steps along the way. And you may fail at any one of those steps in the science, but you also may suffer a change in strategic business direction at any step in the way, which means that for actually no bad reason for the science, but just that the funding strategy shifted, your technology gets set to the side. I think that there's an opportunity, and the type of programs that are described in theory should help academics have a stronger set of tools to make sure that they will not suffer the fate of getting displaced during that handoff from one part of the process to the next. And so I think the pitch from my standpoint is actually not to say to you, hey, you should all go out and develop technology for commercial purposes. That's wonderful if you want to, and I think there are a lot of good reasons why you should want to. But I think more importantly, you can function at a very high level in the academic realm, and you can help to guide your technologies. But in order to do that, you have to have some vocabulary. You have to have some education. You have to have some training so that you can reach across the aisle and interact with the commercial side, even if it's just to make sure that your technology gets pushed off into the right organization that's going to capitalize on it. So what we're seeking to build here at Mount Sinai is a culture that embraces this interaction, that allows us to leverage the fabulous science and medicine that goes on here. And to do that, we'll be building out over time a series of programs that will reach out both to students and faculty to give you some of the vocabulary, to give you some of the tools, to give you some of the process that will give your technologies a better chance to thrive.
Thank you, Jeff. Those were great overviews, and I think we'll spend the remainder of the session addressing some questions. We had generated some in advance, but again, I encourage folks to step up to the mic, or Anthony and Nadim are tracking the tweets, so feel free, but maybe you want to start?
Yeah, I'm Anthony Melendez. I'm a second-year medical student here at Mount Sinai. Dr. Lee, I have a question for you that ties together kind of what Mr. Smith was saying. You said one of your goals was translating innovation into a useful product. Mm-hmm. So that's the essence of the culture that's being created here. So what are 2 or 3 key features about your program that foster or allow for an innovative idea to become a useful product?
No, that's a great question. So I think there are one of the strengths of UCSF, like Mount Sinai, is that we've got great science. There's a ton of great discovery science going on. And some of that science is really appropriate for appropriate for potential product, and some are not. So utilizing the right filter to identify the technology that has that product potential is really essential. I think having the scientific input and scientific expertise to identify good science is important, but then that additional filter of having people who understand what it means to then turn that science into a useful product, who understand what the market is looking for, what the regulatory path might look like. Is there a regulatory path? Is there true IP here that can help protect the technology to a place where you're going to get sufficient interest out there? So having the right filter to identify the right science is really important. And once the right science is identified to be enabled and to be supported, bringing the right team players around the table to help it. Like I think it's, the whole notion of concurrent engineering that Steve Jobs talked about is really relevant here. I think handing off a science project to someone who's going to do the product development is not the right way to go. Getting all those people who are going to be seeing that as a product at every stage of that life cycle early on is really important to inform how that project gets moved along. So people who are going to be using it as end users, people who are going to be marketing it as a product, people who are going to be putting together the development plan, people who might be part of the regulatory review process, getting people who might give money so you can actually do the first toxicology study, getting them all around the table to talk about what's going to be required to move it along, and what it needs to look like today, what it might need to look like in 2 years' time is really important. So I think those two are probably two of the most critical things.
There's a question from the audience.
Yeah, hi, it's Mark Slimiani, NYU School of Medicine. I'm wondering, to just ask the panel, what's being considered in terms of frugal innovation, considering its potential for value capture both in the developing world, but also in the BRICS and developing world?
I'm sorry, what type of innovation?
Frugal innovation.
Frugal.
Frugal innovation, right. The Hindi term, like for example, Jugaad innovation.
Yeah, actually, that's an area that CIMIT's been very active in, and of course, the initial hypothesis is we're going to do good by helping across the world. And of course, the biggest problem that we run into is creating business models that were sustainable. And over the last couple of years, we've come to the recognition that a lot of technologies that are targeted at low resource settings, frugal innovations, we could use them here in the U.S. So a lot of what we've been doing is focusing on technologies which frankly leverage the cell phone capabilities that are pervasively available in the developing worlds, and asking, can we create a sustainable business model here in the U.S. or Asia or Europe, which will then create enough economic value to be able to deploy them in the developing world.
Either of you want to make a comment, June?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great question. Innovation, I guess, doesn't really need to mean increasing cost. And especially with the evolving reimbursement scheme in hospital care, I think innovation really has to address how to prevent costs as well. There are never events that are well articulated that don't get reimbursed in healthcare settings, like decubitized ulcer, like UTI associated with Foley catheters. So I think innovation in the future today and in the future are going to have to address how to prevent costs as well. It's first identifying what those cost drivers are, where innovation can make a difference, an appreciable difference, is really important. Those never events are a good place to start, but I'm certain to be others.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, because I think, from our perspective, a lot of what we try to do is leverage technology that comes from a wide variety of industry. And you look at every single other industry, and what does technology do? It slashes costs and improves performance at the same time. And frankly, what has technology done in healthcare? Frankly, has provided marginal improvement in performance at a substantially increased cost. That is just not sustainable. So we believe very firmly that there is significant opportunities for technologies to come in and really disrupt healthcare. We were talking a little bit before, but why focus on the hospital itself? I think the whole example being, pushing care to where it makes the most sense, moving it out from a hospital setting to a clinical setting to a retail setting to a residential setting, and ultimately into homes. Very not straightforward. Clearly, that's an area in which technology can play a significant role and still allow the clinicians to do what they do exceptionally well, which is to interpret data and develop the relationships with the patients to help them with their unique challenges. But I think absolutely cost at this point is really a core for what we need to do in the U.S.
But isn't there a paradox there? I mean, you're trying to drive, there's a commercial interest in generating profit, so that drives the costs up. So how do you reconcile an effort to infuse technology that generates profit for commercial entities while still driving down the costs in the healthcare setting?
Maybe go back to Ivan. I think you had addressed that pretty well. You can definitely make a lot of money by driving volume up and taking a little bit of share away from somebody else. So it's definitely not a zero-sum game when it comes to innovation, particularly when you look at the number of people who are not. I'm not sure what the number is, but you ask yourself, all right, what is the current standard of care for any particular procedure? And then ask yourself, what fraction of Americans, let alone people across the world, are getting access to that current standard of care? It's small. So if we stopped new innovations and all we did was focusing on getting the current standard of care available to people, I would argue that would be a tremendous economic benefit, and companies would benefit as well. So I think those are the sorts of things that we ought to be thinking about as we define innovation and what our areas of focus are.
Right, and the other aspect, I think, is from an academic institution perspective. Encouraging and enabling and supporting innovation is not primarily about seeing the return on investment in terms of dollars. It's ensuring that the really great technologies that are developed in universities get to see patients or get to the place where it's meant to be. And the driver isn't about how much we get. We know that a very small fraction of all disclosures ever end up generating revenues for the university. But developing it in such a way that there are people out there who are willing to take that on and to develop and to take it further. Again, I mean, how much they end up charging for the technology that leaves the university is less relevant to us.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I think one other important point is we do see a lot of the large companies are risk adverse and they don't want to displace their product line. So what we see, again, in the area, and pharma could be a little bit different, but in devices and procedures, et cetera, we see that a path to go forward with is oftentimes you've got to be prepared to go to the NewCo route and basically get a company and you de-risk it. And it's only after that NewCo goes in and basically disrupts a large organization that large organization will ultimately probably purchase it. So I really do think that disruptive innovation, someone can make money. It's not necessarily the large incumbents with their existing business models, but they're ripe for disruption.
I think we have a question.
My name is Anna Tinge-Lyons. I think this is a great panel. I have a question. If you look at device innovation, users are often innovators, correct? Academic physicians have developed many of the key technologies, fiber optic endoscopes, imaging technologies that are being used in medicine today. Critical to the innovation process was collaboration between engineers and physicists and clinicians. Mount Sinai does not have an engineering school. Is that a hurdle? How would you forge collaborations between clinicians here and engineers and physicists?
I like to answer that one with a joke. Is it better to have a boat or a friend with a boat? Or maybe a friend with a fleet? So I would say that, as we were talking about before, you're in a rich area of being able to access technical resources. So I would say that you're actually in no disadvantage at all in not having an engineering school, frankly, given that what we've seen in some places where there's a lot of political issues between schools, that you're frankly better off in being able to play with everyone in the neighborhood. You've got some great technical resources, so I think you're in a great position, frankly.
And as you know, UCSF also does not have a school of engineering nor a school of business. But we have access to Berkeley engineers. We have access to the many engineers in the industry around us. And so these are all people that we bring on board to help with technologies that warrant it.
And what I would strongly, I think one of the biggest things that John Parrish is able to do with CIMIT is to get agreements from those institutions to participate, not just the investigators, and have a basic set of rules around how you share intellectual property, how you deal with confidentiality. So all of those agreements are in place right from the get-go rather than after the fact, because otherwise you'd be involved in dealing with lawyers more so than doing the technical work. So I'd focus really on that institution-to-institution collaboration. It's definitely support investigator-to-investigator collaboration, but it's got to be institution-to-institution.
You know, Anatine, one thing I think that brings up is this notion of network and the network and development. Sinai's not going to have everything that you need for most technologies. You're going to have pieces here and you're going to have pieces distributed elsewhere in the network. And what we probably have to do a better job is figuring out how do we manage that network? How do we reach across and foster institution-to-institution collaboration? How do we make it easier for individual investigators who may need to strike a collaboration? And again, I think that's part of what's beginning to go on here. So there are a lot of conversations across this campus about this topic. And you know, it was interesting for me to hear Dean Charney talk about having little interest in silos, that you know, we need to do a better job of that. And as a newcomer here, I've spent a lot of time wandering around campus talking to different groups, and it is striking to me how much information I capture by wandering around, but how much information is not getting out into the network more broadly. And so partly we're going to have to, it's an institution design question. We've got to think about how do we communicate better internally, and then when we've done that and identified that engineering may be a need, what network can we then connect to, and how can we make it easy for investigators to do that? So it's definitely higher on our agenda.
Question?
Yeah, Bruce Gelb. I'm not sure who my question is for, perhaps for June. So in the keynote, I haven't talked about the regulatory environment, and one in ours is around conflict of interest. And I was wondering if you could speak to how, at the one hand, how your institution is navigating that. We're seeing increased restrictions around publishing and even presenting at national meetings around collaborative with industry, and yet clearly there's a need for doing that. How has your institution dealt with that?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the expert on that arena, other than in the context of the T1 Catalyst program, and all of the industry experts who come on to help our program are all volunteers, and they all sign NDAs, and they're strictly there to help our faculty. So our faculty doesn't accept money from them unless we have separate agreement that then leads to these industry partners then taking on a bigger role, in which case conflict of interest is really, you know, more clearly articulated. So within the context of the program, it has not really been a challenge.
Yeah, and actually in the Harvard-based system, we're finding the reverse. Conflict of interest is becoming more of an issue. And again, from an outsider's perspective, I find it astounding that the academics feel the only potential conflict of interest is a financial conflict of interest when you look at all the other conflicts. You know, so I think what we've been advocating is very much disclosure. Let people know what's going on and just manage those aggressively. So the more voices that are out there for reason in basically disclosing and managing versus avoiding, I would like all those voices to join me.
We have another question from the audience?
Hi, I'm Bonnie Davis, and I chair our Board of Trustees Subcommittee on Technology Transfer. The question is for Mr. or Dr. Collins. The sort of lowest level member of your program that you described is someone who interacts directly with researchers and helps them at the earliest point. What I'd like to know is, could you review for me when they get involved, what they do, And then I'd like to know, because your organization covers a wide geographical area, where are they? Where do they go to work? How much time do they spend in the institutions versus where you are? And then I'd like to know approximately what's the ratio of them to the people that they cover.
Let's see. I guess the first, in terms of what we refer to as our facilitators, and really everyone in CIMIT, we're a small organization. We've got about 20 staff. So we are all, in one form or another, playing administrative roles, but more importantly, playing roles and working with our investigators. And the way we typically engage our investigators is through our funding vehicles, these innovation grants. Last year, we got about 300 or so pre-proposals, and we down-selected those to 150 full proposals and funded 50. Our focus is on those 300, not on the 50. So what we try to do is provide support to all 300 of them, again, because our mission is not to maximize financial return, is to maximize long-term return, which sometimes means, through the project itself, but frankly, more often than not, it's the second or the third or the fourth idea that innovator has. So that's the kind of the focus of what we try to do. And, I'm sorry, your second question was where do they sit, or?
Physically, yeah, where are they? What do they do when they come to work?
Yeah, and very much, I should have mentioned, the CIMIT is a virtual center.
Yeah.
So we do not have our own bricks and mortar for new facilities. That all of the work for our innovation awards are typically done within the labs themselves, and 80% of the work for our accelerator projects are typically done in contract research and development houses because it's much more commercially oriented. And the last thing I think you want to do is something under robust design control, do that in an academic setting versus do that in a setting which is really designed to do product development and commercialization. And your last question was what fraction of?
How many of these people do you have, and how many researchers do they cover? Well, now we know it's about 300, or is it 300 a year?
We get about 300 researchers a year, or proposals a year. Probably represents about 250 or so distinct ones. So at this point in time, we've funded over 600 projects in our life, and that represents collectively well over 1,000 individuals that we've supported. But we try to reach out to them through forums and other things to provide support that goes beyond the project-specific support.
And how many facilitators?
As I say, we've got about 20 staff, and they're all facilitating, sometimes from a contract management perspective, sometimes from a marketing perspective, but that's the scale of our resources.
Thank you.
So we actually have a question from Twitter from Brett Marinelli. The question is, how do we deal with the belief held by many great researchers that commercialization of an idea leads to biased science?
I guess
I'm going to comment on that because I have worked with a lot of great researchers, and it's been a real joy. Biased science. So
let me frame it a little differently, Jeff. Can an investigator who has potential commercial gain be objective about his or her invention, science, research, intellectual property?
Yeah, no, you can't be objective. You're highly invested in it. You want it to be true. I mean, that's part of what happens in the commercialization process, though. Every party around that table has a high degree of interest that the science is correct. And it is a challenge. When you take something that has been developed in the academic industry and applied an academic point of view to it, there are certain things that you will not have done that would be interesting to the commercial side. And so I actually think that what we struggle more with is not whether there's a bias, it's whether the right information has been generated and at what point. And so, tox may be a huge issue for us as we're getting involved with an early project. It may have been less of an issue for the academic who's just trying to understand the mechanism of action of the area that they're looking at. So, we have not, on the investing side, had a lot of problem with the bias. We assume that somebody coming in is biased to a certain extent, but we also assume that people have gotten to a point in their career where they have learned what the rules are, that they've published through rigorous peer-reviewed journals, and that there has to be a weight of evidence, a body of science to rely on I think that there has been a lot made in the venture capital press recently about the low rate of reproducibility of a lot of academic science. And so you can read people like Bruce Booth, who's a venture capitalist in Boston, who make a big deal about, we won't touch any academic science unless we've taken it out to a commercial enterprise and had them replicate the science. Does that mean that the science is not replicable because there was a bias from the investigator or some other set of issues? I mean, I guess that's a fair question, but by and large, we haven't noticed that somebody's fudging the data. They may present it in a way that requires, as part of your due diligence process, that you push against it. It means the people involved with the process have to all understand where the motivations of each player around the table are, but I don't think that that's any different than any other interaction that you would have in most places in the world.
And I would say, being passionate about your science doesn't necessarily preclude you from being able to produce unbiased science. And I think as academicians who are to display a high degree of integrity, I think we should expect unbiased science, whether or not they feel passionate about their project. And I think in the commercialization process, there are, like Jeff just mentioned, there are many checks and balances, because there are a lot of people who are going to want to make sure that the science that you present is accurate and that it's the right data, and before they're willing to write a check. Perhaps, and this might be somewhat controversial, but perhaps to a certain extent, even more than getting a paper published in a high-tier journal. So I do think, yes, people who are behind the science and who generate the science should be passionate. I definitely don't think that means that they are incapable of producing unbiased science.
Fair enough. Thanks. Ross?
Hi. Yeah, and I would also say, I haven't done a survey on that, but when there has been problems with researchers fudging data, I don't think that's been necessarily those that are trying to get it commercialized. My question is, and I guess it would start with June. Mm-hmm. Do you have metrics on how all this has worked? So in other words, has this approach actually been successful in, by some criteria, increasing innovation, increasing success in translational science, and so on? So in other words, has it been money well spent?
Yes, good question. As you know, these early stage technologies in universities, if you really want true measure in terms of return on investment that everybody can agree to, that can take a long time, especially in the health arena. It could be 10 or 15 years before you start to really see that sort of return on investment and seeing products that you worked on, seeing technology that you worked on which end up as products, seeing patients. But we do believe that some of the earlier surrogates that we're following indicate that we're really making an impact. We have been successful in getting a number of our faculty follow-on funding from external sources, from foundations, and have been successful in getting some good strategic partnerships lined up that take the technology to the next place. We've also, I think, making good decisions to let some of the programs go. It's also a success measure. In fact, we had a technology that a faculty, the science was great, wanted to work on another HIV therapy, but it was, science was fascinating, but it was working on a host factor. We got on the phone to speak with the folks at Gilead and said, there is no appetite, given the safety hurdles, the high safety hurdles in the HIV chronic therapy space, there's no appetite for anyone wanting to take on a host factor. So that's what we told the faculty, and that person doesn't have to work on that from that perspective, because if his intent is to understand science behind it, by all means, but if his intent is to continue to move that program toward a product, then we know that there isn't really a market for it. So, so I think helping faculty make good decisions on how they spend their valuable time is also an important metric for us.
Yeah, if I can just add, though, from a metrics perspective, is something that's near and dear to my heart, because for an organization like ours, you measure, you get what you measure. And as I mentioned a couple of years ago, we had undertaken our clinical impact study, which is a very painful process to go back and look at our 600 projects, trying to understand, what are the metrics from a stakeholder perspective, with financial being only one, but career advancement and other things being very important to the sustainability of projects like this. And I think from a Mount Sinai perspective, I would really strenuously urge you to kind of think about those metrics of success very, very broadly. And one of the things that we've been doing in the meantime is trying to build, again, web-based tools that allow us to track projects after we've funded them. We're really good at tracking projects during funding. But whatever happened to X, Y, or Z, because it does take an awful lot of time, and watching those projects over time really helps as you do retrospective reviews to understand what were your decision-making processes and how can you improve your criteria going forward.
Question from the audience.
Great. This is going to be a little bit of a long question. It's actually going to shift the model to how we think about scientists and their careers and new models in it. To give you a background, my name is Pam Carroll. Right now I'm unemployed. But to give you about my background, I've been at 3 pharmaceutical companies. Most recently, I was head of the Nutley site in oncology and for Roche, and also global head of pathways biology. In a couple months, I started Janssen as vice president of external innovation for oncology, moving back up to Boston. Prior to that, I was actually head of, and I hate to give my resume, but I think I've been in this space for a really long time. And I was head of research at the Belfer Institute. It was almost a biotech company within Dana-Farber, and I was, where we had a professional institute of 70 scientists that were not postdocs or graduate students. I didn't have any graduate students that worked with me. We worked with corporate companies to do the things that happen better in academics, which is biology, and take the innovations from the labs, allow the postdocs and faculty to publish, do the IP within Dana-Farber, and then work with the companies to then make drugs. As you know, there's a seismic shift going on in the pharmaceutical companies where, and I've seen it and I've been part of this, which is it's hard to do good biology within there. And you talk about losing Alzheimer's within companies, it's just hard to get that expertise. That expertise and boutiqueness happens in academics. Companies do other things much better. So what I see now, and I can say this because I'm luckily unemployed for 2 months and I chose that, is that we have to create new models. And we have to create new models of taking people with industry experience and people, and also training our postdocs to be able to do industry and bringing those together. And part of it is that academics have always been siloed into academic and then their postdocs and not great working wage personnel are working within those confines. And so I just think one of the things I think needs to change is complete innovation of how we do science from a personnel level to keep great science in this country. And so I'll throw that out there and get away from the IP and commercial aspects.
Well, maybe I can direct that, because I think that's right in our emerging sweet spot here as an institution, and I think Jeff is going to be spearheading that. So thank you for the question. Jeff, you want to tackle that? How do we bridge the divide or eliminate the divide and sow creativity in academia that fertilizes pharma or biotech? And how do we train people to do it?
Yeah. So again, I think it's the right question, but it's one that I often find is framed that academics need to learn to speak industry. And I find that I'm quite often guilty of this as well, that we think that it's everybody else's duty to reach across and figure out how industry works and all. And I do think there is something to that. I think it is important, particularly in the training of students and postdocs, to give them more exposure, if they're interested, in how industry speaks. I think it is helpful to get people to understand about what things may be better in academia, whether you think it's biology as an example, and what things are important in industry. But I think if you think about the institution as a whole, and you want to make the institution more effective at promoting innovation and technology development, we do have to think about the individual investigator. And so you have to think about career track, and you have to think about metrics for promotion. Is it merely getting grants? Is it merely publishing? Or should we be giving consideration to make an institution more networked and more connected to industry? Is it that we should think about the PhD thesis and think about ways to potentially make that thesis work for some students much more applied in orientation? Is it that we need to change the culture so that when you put up your slide that says conflict of interest disclosure, that it is really not a conflict of interest disclosure per se, but maybe it's just indicating what your financial interest is? Or maybe we have to define the conflict of interest broader so that it isn't just what your financial interests are, but that you can be more credible about what your conflicts may be. And I think in that is a lot of change. And I think that there are a lot of challenges institutionally. So if you just take the promotions process, that's a big sea change for people. If you take the change in orientation that maybe somebody can sit in an academic institution, go into industry for a period of time, and then come back to the academic side, and that can be viewed as a positive and not a negative. And these are things that I've seen in my time in the industry. There's a more permeable membrane. People are beginning to move back and forth more. And so I think over time these barriers will get broken down, in part by need. Both sides of this equation need each other. People in academia need some of this collaboration with industry for certain activities. It's clear that industry needs academia to drive new innovation. And so I think the bigger question is, why has it been so slow to happen? And I think that that's, foundational to a lot of large organizations that are highly bureaucratic and do things a certain way, that have historically been very siloed. And that we're in the midst of that process of the silos beginning to break up, that the world looks much more networked. I mean, if you think about John's comment about how much work they do out in a distributed framework, that you're not doing it all inside your institutions, if 80% of it is going out to commercial partners early on, that by definition is going to change how your investigator interacts with industry and what that does in terms of their career progression, because that means some amount of their time is bound up in that. So I don't think there's a particularly simple answer, but I can tell you the things that we're going to do here are we are going to look into more applied opportunities for the PhD work. We are going to push for faculty to get more reward in the general promotions process for promoting innovation and doing technology development. We're going to build programs much like June has described, where we have both education, and sometimes the education is, hey, that's actually not a good project for a commercial side, and maybe you should stick with it with more of an academic hat. And I think over time, the accretion of all those small steps will benefit the individual and then the collective as well.
Nadim, any questions from Twitter or?
There's one question that we could ask maybe on behalf of Jeff Smith to Dr. Lee, and on behalf of all of Sinai. Looking back on the growth and the creation of your program, were there any missteps that could have been avoided or any unexpected obstacles when you were developing your program?
Right, so I mentioned that the program predated my arrival at UCSF. And the initial idea was the same, that we really put together teams that can help move technologies along. But the initial consultation model was built on a fee-for-service basis, and these consultants actually cost a lot. And so they ended up not being able to offer help to very many faculty. So in the last year and a half, we've been able to convert and enlarge that consultant pool substantially, so that really virtually not just people whose programs have product development potential, but people where we think it's a good educational opportunity, we offer consultations as well. So I think that so given the resource constraints that all academic institutions face, UCSF not accepted, we've been able to stretch in that way, and that's worked quite well.
John, what would you have done differently if you could do it over?
Oh, nothing. It's all worked perfectly. I think one of the key things, we continue to make mistakes every day and really encourage the making mistakes. And I think the most important thing is be prepared to learn from those mistakes. I think initially there was a huge debate within CIMIT whether or not we should be doing kind of big tech push activities or clinical pull. And we spent probably 5 or 6 years answering that question, and came out pretty clearly that it's clinical pull in our case. I think the other other thing that we have experimented quite a bit is frankly, we're dealing with some very siloed organizations. And one of the things that CIMIT became, for a period of time, we started to look more and more like our organizations themselves. So CIMIT itself became siloed, I think, in response to making it look more easy to interface with our organizations. So I would strongly encourage that temptation be wholeheartedly resist and avoid silos. And I think the last thing is it's not necessarily a mistake, but as I say, keep publishing what you're doing and experiment and learn from those mistakes.
We have time for one more question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Preeti Balchandani. I'm a new assistant professor here. I just came from Stanford, and there's this summer entrepreneurship program where postdocs can participate and then eventually put forth a pitch to a panel of VCs. I was wondering if we could create a course here where PIs like us could encourage our graduate students or postdocs to take this course and put forth their research and then create a business plan and then finally present it to a panel of VCs.
That's good. This was not a setup, but I'm excited about the question. So I have actually been working with Joel Dudley and 2 professors at Columbia, and we are hoping to launch this summer a summer entrepreneurship program here in New York. Would be across New York, so it wouldn't necessarily just be for Sinai folks, but we'll be hopefully getting that launched, and there'll be more news about that. The theme for this summer will be big data, because all of the other faculty involved in this come out of the data side of the world. But the idea is that each summer we'd have a different theme, and that we would rotate it around different areas. In terms of courses going on here, I'm actually going to speak in a few minutes about some of the educational things that we're doing here, and we are beginning to introduce more courses along the lines that you've described. So if you can stay for the next talk, I'm actually going to get into a little bit more detail on some of those curriculum things that we're doing.
And one of the most successful things I think CIMIT has done is, of course, with first MIT and BU and soon Northeastern, we're kind of flipping around, where we focus on the clinical side and find clinicians with really good problems who are interested in moving forward, don't necessarily know how they're going to go about doing it, and then put them together with a group of typically masters prepared electrical, mechanical, material engineers in a class, and let them kind of spend a semester developing solutions, and quite often then business plans moving forward. That has been just tremendously successful. I'm astounded at what can happen in 3 months with some really bright folks.
June, any curricular changes at UCSF that synergize with your activities?
Yes, so UCSF, we have a number of different programs. We have, out of our Center for Bioentrepreneurship, we have a program called Idea to IPO, which in today's time is a bit of a misnomer, but the idea is really to teach students how to take a scientific idea and make a pitch in the end, and very similar to the summer entrepreneurship class that you describe up there at Stanford. And then we also have a master's in translational medicine program, which was initially funded by Andy Grove, and it's in full swing. It's a 1-year-long program with focus on devices and drugs. We also have a program called GEMS, which is called Graduate Education in Medical Science, focused on giving basic science graduate students some context and thinking about science from a medical perspective. So setting them up to be doing medically relevant science, or more immediately medically relevant science. So we have a combination of programs, and the Center for Bioentrepreneurship also runs many seminar series that relate to bioentrepreneurship. We also have QB3, Quantitative Biology 3, which is another innovation center with UCSF involved, that also runs quite a bit of training and seminar series as well.
Well, the time to close this session has arrived, sadly. This was fantastic. I really want to thank our speakers. I also want to express my gratitude to Mr. Seidenberg for setting up this panel so beautifully. We're going to take a 30-minute break and reconvene at 11. But again, I want to thank our external speakers and Jeff Smith very much.